the next story is sort of similar kind of thing, which is that in France, they put in place a similar social media ban for under 15s, is sort of copying the Australia ban and elsewhere that is trying a ban, except that this constitutional court said, no, you can't do that. And this was, this was a thing that Emmanuel Macron rushed in. He wanted it to be his legacy, and he wanted it in place before the school year started.
He got it done.
He got it done. And then it got undone by the French Constitutional Court, which was very interesting, where they, very short, very easily readable decision, where they just said, this is way too broad. And even if there is a legitimate interest, and they said, the government has a legitimate interest in protecting children, this is not the way to do it. Kids have some amount of rights as well that we have to respect. And also, the only way to implement this is through universal age verification. And that creates massive privacy problems. And I think it was very, it was really good to see the court come out and say that. And I think, some of the reasoning behind it also applies elsewhere in Europe, as other countries in Europe start rushing to try and apply this as well. What did you think of that ruling?
There's been so many of these now that I guess I wonder, if this is almost like Project 2025 kind of initiative, where there's model legislation that has been written and then just gets copied and pasted in all these different jurisdictions. Because
I was going to say, I feel like goes back to Jonathan Haidt. I mean,
yeah. I guess I felt like there was there was a tipping point after which there was the narrative, and I do think the anxious generation, cauterized or not cauterized, sort of mobilized a lot of people to be like, oh, we must take action, we must do something, and then the question is, well, what do we do? And then it's banhammer, and that became the solution. And in the result, as a result of seeing that play out, I think a lot of the nuance and trade-offs, that many of us in this space have been talking about for years, now suddenly come to the fore, because you're like, oh, well, you ban that, but now you have to implement universal age verification. And then we go to the question of, well, at what level of the stack does that exist? And that means now your computer is adversarial to the user, because it requires you to reveal information about yourself in order for you to gain access to it. And so that is a very different sort of proposition, where it's almost like a citizenship verification. Now it's like age verification in order for you to use the thing that unlocks communication, unlocks commerce, unlocks all manner of different things. And I mean, just again, going back to my Apple Cash experience, where it's there had to be an identity, card that was taking a photograph in order to get the age verification in order to open up this Apple Cash account. Now you're talking about doing that just to allow anyone to use any kind of device. And the ways in which that can go wrong, the problems with that are rife. And so unless you have the apparatus set up to provide support to that, and as in the era of reducing government and Doge and things like that, that there's going to be this massive set of people that are disenfranchised because they can't get through the system because they look too old, or they type like an adult, or they don't, or they type like a child and they're 35, and there's just these false positives, and you're left in this kind of limbo state. This, who was the author that talked about being in this purgatory? Anyways, classic story, Kafka, a Kafka sort of situation, right? Where you can't use computers because it thinks that you're 12 when you're not. So anyways, I think it's good though that the courts are pushing back to some degree, especially in these overly broad circumstances. Because as we mentioned before, it's the implementation and the enforcement that ultimately imperils people who are less well-resourced.